Hey everyone, and welcome back to Story Deep Dive with Rachel and Dana. This week we are wrapping up our discussion of Cold and Deadly by Toni Anderson. So we're going to talk about some of our editor's takes and writer takeaways this week. But first and foremost, most importantly, Dana, tell me about Danger Tales and what's happening. What's new? What's going on 4 weeks in the future? A show behind the curtain, but tell me what's in your future, Dana.
I see my future.
There's a nap somewhere in there, I'm sure of it.
Please, if anybody loves me anywhere at any time. This is one of the things that we're going to be having that's coming up that's going to be so cool. So last year, we have a book club that's called Storyteller Book Club that goes across Inner Circle and DTW. And last year, this time of year, that's when we read the Knock 'Em Out series. Ooh. We read all 3 books back to back. And then I feel like now all examples are Knock 'Em Out. But primarily it's because as a community, we've read the entire series.
Everyone knows the whole situation.
Exactly. Give or take a few people, but for the most part, we can say that and everybody's collective nod. So this year I was like, oh man, I need to find another one. But all the series I kept looking at, they were longer, like 5 books or whatever. And I'm like, oh, that's too many. And we usually have we don't have book club in December because we have our retreat. And so we're heading that way, which I can't believe it because it's the last 6 months of the year. Ooh. So what I decided is we're going to do a deep dive on one book.
Hell yeah! That's so exciting!
So we're going to do, I picked the book. I tried to pick something else fairly light, got a little rom-com, still got a little emotion, so it has layered characters. I haven't read this particular book, but I read other books in the series, and it's a book 1. I usually try to do book 1s. So just as a heads up to people who are listening, normally for our book club, I try to find books that have audiobook because everyone is usually writing and busy. I also try to find some books that all of our authors that are part of it can learn something from, because we have people that do cozy and thriller and romance, of course, and all a lot of subgenres of romance. And so I picked the book. So what we're going to do is 1 month, we'll read the whole book. And then over the next 5 months, or it's a total of 5 months, we're going to do act by act.
Oh, I love, that's so funny. I've been thinking about something similar for some of the group coaching that I'm getting ready to launch over here as well. And just thinking about the different lenses, right, that you can take. So where you're reading wide, so you're getting lots of different books and seeing lots of different authors at work, but also taking that time to go really, so literally Trevor and I were just talking about that yesterday. So hearing you say that today is ooh, that's so exciting.
It is, because at first I was like, oh, it might be boring, but we have so many things going on. We want the summer to sort of calm down for DTW, because people are coming in and out. Kids are out of school. Yeah, we have people that are reworking their brands because of the boot camp. And so to have time to still write and still participate without it being a huge ask.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're going to be doing that starting in June. Will be the full read. Then we'll do July, August, September, October. Then we'll have one more read in November, which is 9 times out of 10 going to be a fantasy or a PNR. And then we don't have a book in December, and that'll finish out our year.
Wow. Okay. So you've got, so do you have the rest of the scheduling program for DTW as well through that? Because I think you planned all of your workshops at the beginning of the year, right? So you know the overarching trajectory that the community is on for the rest of the year.
Yes, and some of it, I leave it room for changes, which is why we're looking at the second half of the year, because Keeman and I, y'all, if I ever say Keeman, it's my husband. We go for our walks. We talk through what, I'm doing, planning, teaching, all that stuff. And I was telling him how I really wanted us to do some stuff that was sort of low key but active, so that when they get on the other side of it, they've built something and sort of don't realize it. So we have one big project that we're doing over the summer, and then we have a writing challenge in July and a writing challenge in November. So that's sort of our whole. And then for workshops, I am not going to do workshops the whole summer. I think I'm only going to do maybe one in the summer. And then we'll just do like replays of others, since the community will be doing other stuff. And then, and pretty much that's going to carry us through the year.
Nice.
I may do a couple of like redos, but for the most part, it's really going to be focused on shoring up things that we've learned this year through the end of this like last couple of months, and them going into that reading to being able to pinpoint the elements. And then writing, so.
Wow.
Yeah.
Cool. That sounds so fun.
Listen. And if I do end up teaching every single month, which I don't think I will, the workshops will probably just be reiterations so that it will support what we're doing in the community.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Sounds pretty exciting.
It is.
Is DTW, is it open for enrollment all year round?
It is. I think that's what we're trying to. It is. Yes.
Okay, I respect it. If you're like, you know what, we don't know, and I'm not going to firm up an answer right here live. Reasonable.
And it is, but I think the thing, because we've been doing workshops and they're sort of like feel like an open house sort of style, like people can participate, but they are not in. I feel like we will, but maybe have two big things a year that sort of spotlight it, just to really keep it going. Because we're almost at the place where we can maybe start doing other things like run ads and just keep the energy going inside of the community. And then we can also sort of move ahead while feel like we're slowing the pace down a little bit. And so, but in general, yes, it is open, and just sort of changing the perspective of it. Cause, I don't know, we were walking one day and I realized, I was like, you know what? I think the true like approach of it is that you are, walking around with a coach in your pocket at all times, like even if you didn't participate in anything but one Q&A, that'd be well worth your $100, because it'd be way more than that to get me on a call one-on-one. Right. And so I think even given that, it's just like a relaxed sort of vibe. But I think seeing the students that have been picking up on what we've done so far, because we've just reached a year, we're a little over a year old.
I was just thinking about like you're hitting like a big Danger Tales writers milestone, because you started this. Was it really only last year?
Because I was already doing workshops. That's why it feels like it's been longer.
Wow, that's great. It feels like you've been doing this way, because I remember talking, we've talked about it a lot obviously over the last year, and also leading up to it as well, which might be why in my mind it's like been going longer. But it launched around the same time that you started on Substack. It was
around the same time. It is.
Yeah.
Now you're gonna have me look. I'm so awful with dates. I really should just put a big fat X on it so I would know, because it's just like you're asking my brain to work double time. But it was around the same time. And and it's crazy because I don't know what I was thinking, so we're just gonna leave it at that. Because I feel like everything, like so much was happening around the same time that it almost feels like, oh no, I started it in September. I started Substack.
Oh, did you start in September? Oh, it must have been me that started it in the summer. Because that was around.
You started way before me.
Yeah, that was around the time of Pro Writing Aid, and I had been writing on Substack a little bit before then. Yeah,
and then I started. Now, my community started around that time. It was but Yeah, because I was like, maybe, girl, listen, I need to put it down on the calendar and be like,
Well,
because then we can start doing something once a year.
1 year.
Thank you.
Yay.
So yeah, so I'll be buying books. I mean, I got the audio books, but I'm gonna buy the physical copy so that we can just like have a nice little, like a intentional slow read.
Yeah, that's
through the book for the summer.
For the summer,
and
yes.
just yep. So it's all good. What about you? What do you got going on over there?
Well, speaking of books, so I finally started reading The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. So, that's, like a classic of modern fantasy. It's like one of those, it kind of lives up there with like Mistborn. And these are all kind of guys who came on the scene in the industry in fairly similar time. So Brandon Sanderson, Joe Abercrombie, I believe, had them all beat, like was, writing earlier than they, or was published earlier than they were, we'll say. Patrick Rothfuss, there's a few more, but I know that there's some of our staples of modern fantasy at this point. But Patrick Rothfuss, The Name of the Wind, it's been on my list for ages. I kind of kicked it down the road because he hasn't finished the series, and I don't think anyone believes that he's going to fit. Like, I think it's like everyone's like, I don't think this is happening. It's like one of those situations. But I'm working with a client right now, and we're kind of just trying to get a feel for like, okay, what kind of fantasy, like what flavor of fantasy basically do you want this to be? Because he's in an early enough stage that it can take shape really in any direction he wants it to, and it's just a matter of nailing down like what is that story you're looking to tell, what is that flavor of fantasy you're looking to engage. And so we're reading this one as we're kind of getting out, he's read the Mistborn trilogy now, we're doing Name of the Wind. And it's really interesting because so often with fantasy, you're really, and we talked about this several weeks ago, where you get into a new book and you're like, what's happening? Like, what's going on? What is like, because everything is new and nothing works the way that you expect it to because it's all fantasy and you're just sort of like, what's happening? And this has been really interesting because I have not had that feeling the entire, like, starting the book. It's like, okay, like, there's not a lot of magic up front. Like, we know that we're in a fantasy, but it's very, like, okay, seems like we're getting kind of, like, classical European rural sort of, that classical fantasy kind of environment, like, sort of pastoral European type of environment, as far as you can tell. We've got an inn, and I think part of what makes it feel so like, as in it's not overwhelming, like I haven't been confused, you're just kind of following normal people doing stuff, and I think because he keeps it in a very narrow scope, and it's a scope in which magic is not being used, which is the main thing that you're usually going to have to explain in a fantasy. Like, so far, I'm like, okay, I'm like, keep it up. I'm like, everything feels like, okay, normal and cool, and I'm not confused, and I just am like, but that is like, I feel cautiously optimistic, so I'm probably, I don't know, I'm maybe up to chapter 8, and we're like, I think we're starting to get into like the main thrust of the story. I didn't read the back, I didn't look at anything, I wanted to go in just totally blank, so I don't even know what the actual story is about, and I kind of just want to see, like, at what point do I catch on to like where this is heading, and where does it surprise me, where am I prepared, where am I unprepared. But yeah, it's been really interesting because standard fare for fantasy is just at the beginning, you're just getting your bearings. And we didn't have that with The Name of the Wind. And so I'm like, ooh, okay, well, like, we're, like, dripping in, like, a little bit of, like, magic now at this point in chapter 8, but nothing too crazy, and, like, nothing has, like, unusual names or anything that I'm, like, having to keep track of. And so it's really, like, it's surprising to me, and I feel like, all right, what's, like, where's the twist, or like what's gonna like sneak up on me and get me? But so far nothing has, so it's been really interesting.
Do you like it?
I do. Something that's really interesting. So, I walked my client through the Brandon Sanderson, through his Mistborn trilogy, which is usually where I start most of my fantasy writers, just because it's very tight plotting. And that's like the first thing that we kind of have to tackle is like tightening their plots. And so it's interesting to go from Brandon Sanderson to Patrick Rothfuss, because Patrick Rothfuss is much more he's much more into prose. So Brandon Sanderson is very like honest that he's like, listen, I'm a plot person. So this is the thing that I like to do, which means that his writing is often very efficient and like straight to the point, and that's his style of writing. Patrick Rothfuss is a little bit more like imagery and language, and so he like leans a little bit more into his prose, which has been really, and I think he does it really well. So it's been really interesting to kind of get to contrast those experiences. So yeah, so far I'm enjoying it. I'm like, I don't know where it's going because I didn't read the back, and I'm just like, whoa, what's gonna happen? It's all a surprise.
Listen, I'm always amazed when you start talking about stories because my lens always came from the romance side. So now what's popular of a romantasy is like sort of more the lane, even though a lot of those books, like I've been starting to go back and read a lot of those that I would feel like are foundational in that regard. But yeah, okay. Well, you keep me posted because I'd be like, what in the world? But listen, if I don't have to look up words and I'm not confused, sign me up 2 times.
Yeah, I mean, because I had you read Ninth House and Mistborn, both of which you were like, excuse me?
Mistborn. Oh, but once they started going, you couldn't stop. But I think, you know what? I feel like a lot of times that's when I get back to my old ways of whether I like audiobooks or not. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes you just digest it better when you can see it versus when you're hearing visual all this cues. Newness.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it is. But yeah, you have. And I'm still knocking on the door of whether I want to read book 2. I'm just waiting for her to announce book 3.
Oh, book 3 is announced. Now, release date is not announced. But she just, the release date, part of it is going to depend on, like, right, because it hasn't been edited yet, but it's looking like it's coming out in 2026. And she released a little teaser for it. It's literally like a couple paragraphs, but this series has my heart. And so if you want to wait to read the second one, like, that's totally fine until we're closer to 2020, like the 2026 release. But I'm so excited. Like, I can't wait. So when she, like, because she did this whole thing where she, she announced the 3rd book in the Ninth House series, and she did on Instagram, like, guess what you think the title is, and she, like, responded to people's guesses about, like, what they are, it's just, like, I'm just so excited. I love it so much. I'm so excited.
Did she release did she say the title?
No, title's still secret.
Girl, wait, first of all, say who she is just in case people did.
Sorry, Leigh Bardugo is, we're talking about Leigh Bardugo and her Ninth House trilogy. So I believe that it's going to end at book 3. That's my assumption. That's as far as I know.
Girl, I'll be saying, ma'am, have several seats until you give me the release date, because I don't want to hear it. Don't play no games with me.
I can't wait for you to read Hellbent, because I feel like if you thought Ninth House, like, if you were like, what? With Ninth House, I feel like Hellbent, I'm going to get the polos that I long for and those, like, voice messages that I long for, which are like, what in the world do you have me reading? What is this?
I feel like I'm going to have to read Ninth House again, then read Hellbent. But I need at least a release date.
Like a reread. We'll do a reread together. It'll be so fun.
You can't even sit still.
I can't. I'm so ready. I already, like, one of my first tattoos is going to be a Ninth House tattoo. Like, I already have an idea of, like, the design. Like, this is my jam right here. And I'm just pumped as hell about it. So, anywho.
Now, the fact that your jam is these crazy ghosting, girl, listen, you can have it.
This is my metal half. This is my listens to metal in the car while she's driving or working half.
Listen, I'm gonna just be an innocent bystander, I guess. I'm just gonna be along for the ride because I asked you to read my crazy steaminess.
That's right. So you get my crazy ghost BS.
Listen, it's only fair play.
Did you know that, have we talked about this? My community on Twitch, they have taken to, like, they've labeled me like a retired goth. Like, that's what they call me now. A retired goth and an internet grandma. Those are the two labels I've been given by my community.
I love the internet grandma, because if that is not you.
The most evocative, accurate description.
Listen, you know what I always call you, old lady Rachel.
It's me. Now, that's like my favorite thing to, like, express to people. Like, when I'm trying to describe myself, I'm like, my best friend is older than me, and she calls me old. Like, this is the dynamic here. So she's got me reading steamy books and finding out about pop culture. Like, she is giving me a whole world education.
And you are always clutching your pearls, okay? Always clutching your pearls.
100% of the time.
Oh, gosh.
All right. So, all of my silliness and shenanigans aside, y'all, I was gonna just do a quick plug of, like, if you guys are curious about DTW writers, like, you should go check out dangertales.com. You can find out more information there. Dana didn't ask me to plug this. I'm just so dang excited about what she's got going on over there that I think you should go take a look. So, let's get back to Cold and Deadly and talk about our editor's takes. So why don't you hit us with a summary first, and then we'll get the high level of what you want to talk about today.
Great. Okay, so Toni Anderson's Cold and Deadly is a masterclass in romantic suspense, blending a gripping FBI investigation with a slow burn romance built on emotional depth and personal stakes. The story follows two complex characters. It's Ava and Dominic. She is a rookie agent driven by grief, and he is a seasoned negotiator haunted by his past, as they are forced to work together while navigating escalating danger, professional boundaries, and unresolved trauma. For writers, it is an example of how to structure a dual protagonist story, layered emotional wounds into plot momentum, and use suspense not just to raise stakes, but to deepen character connection. The romance doesn't interrupt the thriller, it emerges from it. And you will hear all about our final takes on how we merge it together. And yeah, that's Cold and Deadly.
Perfect. All right. Well, listen, this really is, it's such a great combo of suspense and romance. Now, if you've listened to the previous episodes, we do talk about some of the pitfalls and places that we feel like there were some missed opportunities. But on the whole, she pretty fully delivers on what she promised us in the story. So it's really, the previous episodes are just really a great discussion on all of these dynamics. And we're going to just kind of wrap those up for today, for this week's episode. So what are some of those high level takeaways that we want to cover today?
Well, the first one of the high level things that I want to cover, again, is just reminding that this is a true dual protagonist story. The fact that both Ava and Dominic go on their own transformation, and that we see them go through this story dealing with grief and getting closure, while at the same time this investigation and this romantic relationship. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is the parallel arcs, that we sort of have this case in the characters. I just felt like this was just a great combination of what we have talked about over and over again in on this podcast, of that you want this external plot to sort of drive where this story is going. And in this case, it's not just the characters' development, but it's also their sort of healing process, their emotions. And so it's so layered together that I think this is just a great representation of how those arcs move together and how we get to the satisfying end, not just for them having this happily ever after as much as they can in this scenario, but also for the fact that, you know, the murder mystery is solved, and that we really are introduced to this world and their work. And this is a book one of that series. So those are the two things that I really want to make sure we sort of drive home, because I think those are the threads for me that really makes this book a great read.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Perfect. Well, there's two things I want to highlight from our discussion these last couple of weeks. And that's going to be just revisiting, you know, the first chapter, we'll say, you know, chapter, maybe first couple of chapters, the way that she sets up the book, literally the way that it opens, to just talk about how that sets our expectations and some of the things that writers should really look out for in that and things that they can take away from it. As well as the discussion that we had last week about the antagonist, between, you know, when and how to sort of utilize your antagonist POV if you're choosing to do that, as well as the way you want to think about developing your antagonist and some of the things that you can take away from this book about how to develop an antagonist, regardless of whether they show up on whether they get a POV or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm hoping that we may have a few minutes to sort of talk about a few things. And again, we love this. I'm speaking for Rachel. Like, we love this story, but I think that there were a couple of places that there maybe have some missed opportunities that I would like to talk about, not in a sense of just that, but how we as writers maybe could do something a little bit different to strengthen it even more if we have a few minutes towards the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, you guys probably are going to hear, because it's my turn to talk, so I couldn't mute my mic. So you hear the clack, 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 because my keyboard is really loud. It's really funny if I'm gaming, if I'm streaming and gaming and playing with a bunch of people, if I'm panicking and I start button mashing, like, you can hear that I'm panicking because you hear the keyboard going, like, you just hear the the sound of my keyboard and panic typing and okay, so let's start by talking about this sort of, because I feel like these things kind of go together. You know, we have this dual genre and true dual protagonist story. And it also, like, I think this plays in with kind of those parallel arcs, right, that we see between the external story and then Ava's arc and Dominic's arc, which are all kind of moving together.
Mm-hmm. You know, and this is something that we'll talk about too shortly, but it really does lean in the same way. It's like it just kicks off in the middle of action, right? And the fact that we are introduced to this story, you know, page one, where we're at a funeral and they're there because it's someone that is a colleague, but for both of them, he is a mentor. And as we move forward, we see both of them dealing with grief in different ways, and both of them in the ways that they have also dealt with grief in the past, you know, of how they sort of throw themselves into work or they sort of retreat to themselves. And we see that. Now, even as I say that, I love to point out, or I want to point out, that I think Toni Anderson handles this wonderfully, because if you read a story that has anything to do with grief or depression, that can be depressing just in general, right? Like, it's not a fun read. Yeah. Now, sometimes you stick through it because you are invested in the characters, but it does make for a heavy read. But this never really felt that heavy. You do feel the weight of what they're going through. You feel the connection that they had with Van, who was their mentor. And you also see how each of them are sort of handling that death differently. But this story, both of them go through the necessary changes. And we see that as they're going through the cycle of grief or going through the cycle of change, to be in this relationship that at first they don't know is going to be a relationship, that it does require them to change. And so it really is a great demonstration with both the hero and the heroine both having to change, and not just one with the other one sort of like a sub, you know, like a plot, you know, B plot. It is both of them moving forward, and it is instrumental and vital to the case, because that energy is exactly what they bring to the case as well. So it's all woven together, you know, like a three thread cord. Yeah. Like, it's all woven in there together, and we see that. And I think this is a great demonstration of that. versus it being all female and some male that you may find in romance. And then in a suspense environment, if it's a true suspense or thriller, it's more of a male protagonist sort of dominant environment. So to have both of those, you know, playing alongside of each other, it makes for a really great balance.
Yeah, you know, and I think one of the ways that Toni Anderson like established some almost like some relevance to the wound, like she creates an immediate relevance, right? So not that a wound is necessarily like irrelevant, like that, you know, that's often like one of the ways that we look at an internal arc is like, well, what's the wound, right? But the way that she does it in this story, and I love that you pulled this out, is like they're actually both dealing with old grief that they haven't dealt with, but a new present or a newer present grief is like what pulls that kind of up and out to require them to deal with it. So what she does is like takes that case and the death of Van, which is a new grief, and it puts them into this position where they're having to deal with a new grief, and it's forcing them to confront the old grief that they've kind of been carrying around with them. And that's what's exposing them to their own flaws and to their own problems and struggles in the places where they're locked up, and like you said last week or the week before, where they're stuck. And so I think that that's a really great way, you know, if you're thinking about an internal arc for a protagonist or for, you know, two protagonists or whatever, if they have an old wound, using a present circumstance that, you know, mirrors it or is, you know, like similar, like is kind of topically similar, we'll say. So if it's grief in the past, grief in the present, using that to pull up that old thing so that old wound isn't just something they're carrying around with them, like into the story, but it kind of, again, the best way I can say it is like establishes like an immediate relevance to it, of bringing it into the present, and giving sort of external story relevance to that old wound, and bringing it and kind of making it almost a fresh wound in a way that they have to, they're forced to confront it, and those external actions are going to force them to confront it. So I think that was a really clever thing that she did, of anchoring them in old grief and using new grief to basically give them the opportunity to handle their present grief as well as their past grief.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why I really like this is because you have that intersection of romance and suspense, and that usually in romance this is already true, but the relationship can be a disruptor, right? And in this case, they have that disruptor, but it's also something, the present thing. And I think it's because of the relationship that Van held in each of their lives. And he sort of was a placeholder, and now that placeholder no longer exists. And I believe that if you are someone that you sort of wrestle with how to bring that up, how to reconcile that without a bunch of backflashes, or without, you know, doing a whole lot of like thinking to myself and ruminating or whatever, this is a great example of that, even if you don't have the suspense side, because we sort of see it on the page and they're having to deal with it real time, because the fact that it is still, it's like, how do they say, it's not a scab, but it's not a, oh my goodness, I want to get the saying right. It's not a scar, it's a wound. Is that the way you say it? Whenever, oh gosh, I know I'm about to, y'all, if I fluff this up, I'll come back around. There's this saying, whenever you go to like speaking events, of like, whenever you're speaking or talking or whatever, you want to speak from a place that is a scar and not a wound, right? You want something that has been healed, even though it may have remnants of the past. And for them, those places are still, they kind of were still fresh, because they were able to hide from it. And because of this case, and because of their association with each other, which is why I think that FBI scene was so important, they could no longer, or that hostage situation was important, they can no longer hide behind that. And part of that is another reason why they could not be vulnerable in relationships. Right? And romance is the most like intimate of relationships that you can have.
Yeah.
So we get to see that, but in this context, we not only get to see the evolution as characters or in their internal journey towards love, but also in the external because of the circumstances that they find themselves in.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is maybe a good opportunity to kind of like springboard into talking about like the setup of the story and how Toni Anderson I think that she really did just this is a notable story setup because she gave this is like the perfect example. So her first chapter or two, the way she sets up the story as a whole, it's like the perfect example of like establishing the expectations for the story and making it very clear what kind of story this is, what kinds of things we're going to get in this story, what this story is about, the context that we're in. So, you know, when we're looking at this, the way the story opens, minus this, there's sort of like a little brief prologue from the antagonist point of view, which again sets a lot of your expectations as well for like what you're going to experience in the story. That the antagonist is going to be a POV character, so we're not confused when they show up, you know, in POVs later in the story. And then when the story itself opens and we're at the funeral for Van Stamos, and, you know, and we get all of this information, but so just, I think, really seamlessly weaved into that scene where it's like they're burying him in a hurry because there's suspicious circumstances of his death. They think it was a suicide, which is a huge problem because he's Catholic and they want to, you know, they want him to be buried with his wife. And we see Dominic and Ava and they're in the same place at the same time. And the situation escalates, you know, when we have a sniper start shooting at FBI agents, and they're thrown into an action sequence together where they're trying to apprehend a killer, a killer, and, you know, sniper and all of this. And so it very quickly establishes, you know, we're in the FBI, there's been a suspicious death that, you know, Ava's not completely sold on the circumstances of, which is a key crime setup. Like, this is one of your old classic crime setups. It's one, especially for a procedural, right? This is a really, you know, this is a frequently used one for a procedural because it's a great setup, you know, for a mystery. And so it's establishing, you know, we have our main male character, our main female character. They are tossed together where they're going to have to work together, which is, you know, setting us up for what we're going to expect in the story itself of they're going to have to work together. And there is, we know that there's going to be some romance, and we put them, but we get it, just a hint of like attraction because we are at a funeral and in an active shooter situation, so now is not the time for your blood to be boiling. Like, let's just take it one step at a time and deal with the situation at hand. And so we get all of that to set us up for what we're going to experience. And I mean, the stakes are right front and center so fast. The type of conflict that we're in, it's really this is one to look at for first chapters when you're thinking about kicking off a story, setting up the story, and setting those expectations for what kind of story we're in for.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I would say the first couple of chapters and even the first act, this really does match pace pretty consistently with I would say, I'm going to call it a traditional romance, you know, it makes it sound old, but like a traditional romance, we see all the other elements. The fact we even see the first POV for the antagonist, right? We see all of that. And so what she does is she really does set us up and establishes the tone, establishes the dynamic. And I think more than anything, I like the fact that in the establishment of the stakes, she even establishes the layers, that this is personal and it's professional,
yeah,
right? The relationship that they have with Van, and how even their proximity to each other, what comes with that and the risks that are with this. And it's so many sort of tangential like things that are going on that are equally as important that we can't talk about everything, but it's enough that it does keep you, you know, glued to the page. And I think she did a great job. I will say, and I think this would just kind of pair with this, you know, I do think that there's something to be said, and this is a Dana-ism, so I'm just going to keep it 100. I think, you know, us wanting to start off a story in the middle of action, I get why people say that, but I also get how sometimes doing that, we are disruptive to the sense of normal and how they have become comfortable with their discomfort. And it kind of makes it a little bit difficult to sort of backpedal a little bit. And I think we felt that at the beginning of the story, but because she was setting up the other things, it just felt like that was a price we had to pay for being in the middle of like, who's going to go to a funeral and now there's a sniper shooting at FBI agents of all people, you know? And so that is one of those things that I personally, like, I get why it's said, but I also feel like, you know, there are ways to add stakes to your normal life that are pointing to the fact that there needs to be change. And in this case, she sort of just went in. And I think that's why we may have felt a little bit of bumping in some of those other chapters, because we're trying to get an understanding of who they are as individuals so that we can have an appreciation for them as a couple. And so that's one of those bumpy parts in the beginning, but it wasn't so bumpy that it was made it not work. I just think I'm okay with it as long as it's interesting. First chapters, I don't have to have action. I just like to have open loop questions. Yeah. And I think that can make it interesting too. I mean, now there's nothing like a sniper. But that's not my bag. So, but I do want to point that out. So if you start reading and you're like, but this feels, I don't think it ever gets to the point where it feels slow, but it does feel like, oh, okay, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, we were talking about this before we hit record. I think that, so absolutely, you know, and this is something that I actually deal with in particular with my fantasy writers of like, you know, you know, everybody falls on a spectrum. So sometimes you have writers who take way too long to get things started because it's just like, let me show you everything. And then sometimes, you know, because writers are conscious of that advice to not take too long, they start in the middle of the action and it's like, wait, you haven't given us the information we need to care about that action. So like when I talk to my writers, I tell them, what does the audience need to know prior to what, you know, we would call, at least like Robert McKee, I think, is the one who coined the term, the inciting incident, like the inciting incident of the story. What do we need to know? What does the audience need to know prior to the inciting incident in order to understand why the inciting incident matters, right? And so, you know, what she did well is she started in the action, and it was very clear immediately why the inciting incident mattered, right? Not just because of Van's death, but because people started shooting at us, and we were like, that matters because I'm an FBI agent, and someone shooting at FBI agents, immediately relevant. Got it. Like, I'm all caught up. But then, to your point, we kind of backtracked. And if it were my client, what I would have wanted to see is something that's still moving the case forward in some way, so we don't feel like we were moving in a direction and then we like backtracked for a sec and then started moving forward. So we sort of like, you know, that number. Because we've got, like, I know, it's for anyone listening, I'm gesticulating, it's fine, we want to move forward, we don't want to start and stop, like, if you're that curious, check the YouTube video, you'll see it all, I promise.
I was just trying so hard to hold it in, because baby, that next step had me, I was like...
Are you okay, babe? Are you good over there? Did you throw your neck out, old lady Rachel? I feel like I have a lot of nerve being like, yes, Dana, let's do an audio-only medium. Like, I don't physically require my hands and entire body to communicate. Like, words just aren't enough. But So you start in that action, and again, what happens is you kick off this question of who's killing FBI agents? What happened to Van Stamos? So when we're backtracking and we see Ava and she's just like chasing some guy, and it doesn't yield any insights about the case. It doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't even increase her suspicions. Now we have she ruminates a little bit on some stuff, but it's not enough to make that feel like it's carrying the story forward rather than moving us backwards for a second before we can move forward. And so we get the same thing with Dominic, where he's in a position to be able to make a little bit more headway. So he like talks about, getting the case and stuff like that. But it does feel like we toggle back to like, here's them in their normal life. And I'm like, but you already opened up questions that I want answers to. This no longer is that is that important to me as a reader, because we have someone shooting at FBI agents and killing Van Stamos, we think maybe, and I want to know more about that. And so that it slows that sense of progression, because it's not answering the questions that we started asking in that first chapter. And I think that's a part of, we talked about that hostage situation around midpoint. And I think that's part of why, sort of likewise, it didn't feel like the crescendo that it could be, because it was something else happening that wasn't answering questions that we had that were posed at the beginning of the story. And so those are some of those areas where like I would, so first, just like you said, if someone's reading it and they're like, what, feeling a little off, it's the kind of thing that I think you and I would have advised a writer against, and kind of had them smooth that transition out just a little bit so we can see them, even if it's just both of them wrestling against the system to try to get the case or something like that. And then we see how each of them kind of has to navigate the FBI to achieve their ends, and the risks for them, while still getting information about the case and moving that forward. Those are some of those kind of, missed opportunities, I think, where we might have counseled writers just a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm. And I would say, and I'll just say this quickly, I think the way that you can get around that is not just in like, okay, smoothing it over, yes. But I think one of the things, especially if you're new to writing the area, I tell my clients all the time, create a chapter checklist. Yeah. Like every chapter needs, what do I see in the romance? What do I see about this case? Mm-hmm. Or something just very simple like that, because you're not going to just naturally do it. You think you are just by telling the story, but you're not. Yeah. And it's kind of like if you have a whirlybird where there's no connection point, like it's almost as if you have to skip over those chapters. You don't miss anything. Mm-hmm. And you want to try to avoid that. And I think that's an easy fix to something that is so important, and that you can see that even if it moves, the case is moving slowly, there's still movement. Yes. And or acknowledgement of its presence, as far as the story is concerned. Yeah. And so I think this kind of just lends itself well to me when it comes to the parallels, the parallel arcs, which is, we're talking about the romance and the suspense. Mm-hmm. Now with the suspense, I will say that we sort of got to almost say suspense loosely, because at some parts it feels like suspense. Sometimes it feels like thriller. Sometimes it feels like mystery. But she does a really great job of like transitioning us through those phases, through the changes in the case, and also through the changes in the antagonist's understanding of the pursuit that is happening by the FBI. Mm-hmm. And so we do see this. So this is a great representation of all of the elements, right? All of the things for both romance and suspense being satisfied, and she takes us a step further in a way that you really want to aim for, which is it's happening in tandem. Mm-hmm. Right? So the case being solved and their run-ins and brush with the antagonist, even if it's off page, and the progression of their romantic relationship. And so we really do see that happening, and all the while, the emotional depths of that relationship, and the parts of them, just like we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, that unearths those old wounds that they are coming up against, that really needs to be it kind of feels like in some ways they believe they've been healed, but they almost have to separate themselves from being that person anymore. That's a part of their past, but it's not them. And that's sort of the journey that they're going over with those big things from their youth. Yeah. And so I think that that's another one of those things that we talk about all the way through these episodes, whether we're talking about plot or characters, of like that balance, having all those elements present, and really making it so that at each point it's sort of like moving together in all of the stakes that come along with it.
Yeah, and something I want to pull from, I think it was the episode on plot, something I just want to highlight that we talked about. One of the big takeaways here too is like, one of the things you said is like, your reader maybe won't explicitly be like, this feels like suspense and now it feels like thriller, and now, and there, a lot of times your reader won't designate like in those terms and just be actively like, a suspense has these things, therefore I want these things, or, it's not happening. You'll get it with, and you've talked about this before, you'll get that with romance tropes, right? Where people are like, I like these tropes. But for something like suspense, thriller, mystery, which we also discuss are on not just Amazon, because I've looked Barnes and Noble, I've looked there. Everybody just throws them all together, and they're not the same, and they're just in one big pile, and it can lead to a lot of frustration.
Yes.
But knowing what you are aiming for, right? Knowing whether you are, as a writer, do you want it to be a suspense? Are you wanting it to be a thriller? Do you want it to be a mystery? And being knowing what you're trying to accomplish so you can do so intentionally. And that's one of those things that, we talked about along the way, but I want to kind of pull into our takeaways is something to, and we talk about this all the time, and we're going to talk about it with the antagonist here in a second, is make your decisions with intention, so that you can commit to executing well on them. And then your reader, whether or not they know or care that you're doing a suspense versus a thriller versus a mystery, you set the right expectation for them and delivered it, they are happy. And so being mindful of, some of those delineations so that you can choose them with intention and lean into them and deliver fully on them, so you deliver a satisfying experience for your reader.
Mm-hmm. And we're about to go into the antagonist. I just want to say that in English, what Rachel just said.
Please translate. I didn't know I was speaking something besides English. Please tell the people what I meant.
I'm gonna say a lot of it in the back. Y'all, I didn't say that. Okay. I think what this ends up turning into is when you have those fine lines, is that those fine lines are there for a reason, right? And in this particular area, it comes down to what the reader knows versus what the protagonist knows in those given moments. And so when if in a suspense, the readers are aware that danger is coming to them, but the protagonist doesn't know, you are doing something to the reader emotionally, and you want to be able to make that selection intentionally, not just because you're fumbling around, right? And I think that's the biggest thing, is understanding what those moments are and how you're using them. And in this case, how does that affect the case that they're aiming to solve? And in reality, because they were not supposed to be working on the case in the first place, their careers and their relationship.
Yeah. And I think this is a good, kind of a good place to just kind of wrap up, I think, with our discussion just about the antagonist and, how to handle an antagonist, because, so this story, Toni Anderson made the choice to put the antagonist's point of view, in the story, and I think that she just maximized that decision and leaned into that opportunity to the fullest extent, and it's something that is easy to do wrong or poorly, where instead of adding to the stakes and adding to the suspense, you actually undermine yourself by sort of disorienting your reader. And, sometimes you have to do some fancy footwork if you're trying to paper over who it is so that they don't, so that they're not exposed. And then, and we talked about this in last week's episode, where, especially in like, you see this in older crime novels, where it can feel kind of hokey because you just are like, the man in the cloak did the thing, and blah, 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 and you're just sort of like, okay, and the problem being that it doesn't actually add anything to the experience. Whereas Toni Anderson here, she made the choice to put the antagonist's point of view in there, and she utilized it to show the push and pull, right, of the protagonists and the antagonist, and how how the antagonist is maneuvering around the protagonists and their investigation and causing problems and reacting to the things that the protagonists do, while also exploring this other lens of grief. And that's where she really pulled out all the stops to like make the antagonist's point of view really, really matter. So, and then in the end, it pays off in a big way that is really satisfying, so that it wasn't an arbitrary thing that we got, but it really contributed to the story as a whole.
I absolutely agree, and I think it just makes that goal of looking at what your themes are and what you really want readers to sort of take away and experience in your book, where it feels like it's whole, right? It's well-rounded, and that you don't just have somebody out here that just, woke up on the wrong side of the bed. This is someone that was intentional because the pain that they felt was intentional. And it was like, you know what? I feel it. You gonna feel it too. They listen, and baby, they said your pity don't match my pity. He was about to give it, okay? And so that's what we experienced. But what I think it does is just an extension of that character development as well as the plot, that we get to see that on the page, and then we as readers get to experience that. We did say this in I think it was in the plot. No, yeah, maybe it was in the plot, but no, I think it was characters. Because you do better at which one we said what. Y'all, listen, it's one of them. But I think it was in characters. But if you're a person where having this sort of running thread in your mind about what your antagonist is doing, how it's being felt and understood by your protagonist, what are those ripples that are taking place, this would be a great story to look at this, even if you don't do suspense, because there should be some antagonistic energy in whatever you write. I don't care if you're writing clean and wholesome. So, being able to see the effects of that, see the presence of those ripples, this would be a great story to be able to look at that, because we do have those moments where we see and have a level of understanding, if you will, for what the antagonist is experiencing and why this is how the protagonist chose to exercise that grief. And so I think it was just a great addition. And I'm not a fan of it normally. I do it every once in a while, but I just think that sometimes a place where people usually get this wrong to me is that they do not introduce it soon enough.
Yeah.
I think the only thing that was a lost opportunity is we sort of had a POV switch later on that was not in the first act, but at least we had the introduction that we will experience a POV from others. So it was kind of covered in that. And so, yeah, I think that is how we sort of get that antagonistic energy, not just being felt, but on the page.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's this, And that's, I've got two separate threads. I'm going to touch on this one and jump to the next. But, when you talk about like POV choices, I also, like when I'm working with writers, I will just encourage them toward, limiting the number of POVs they're including until their story is well established and we can say this additional point of view adds something to the story. It needs this point of view, or this is going to help us express the theme better, or whatever that thing is. Because it can be easy to like throw in. So when you're doing, say, fantasy and you're doing third person limited, you can sort of set an expectation that we're primarily in this POV, but we're occasionally going to get others, right? So like if you think about Mistborn, the prologue is from Lord Tresting's POV. But even though the primary POVs we're going to get are Vin and Kelsier, but we had a prologue, from Lord Chesting's point of view, and then we get I think it's also in the prologue where we have a brief sort of short scene from Mendis's point of view, who's a super minor character, and so it just kind of sets the expectation that we're going to primarily be in these points of view, but occasionally we're going to get some other ones, and we get a few sort of intentionally selected points of view that we'll kind of sprinkle in along the way. But, I think leaning into, if you're following one protagonist, then their point of view, or a dual protagonist, leaning into the points of view that are sort of your central points of view first, getting those nailed down, and not... Because it's easy to sort of just start throwing in other points of view because you're sort of like, oh, I need to get this information across, or this could be interesting, or what, and then you kind of get some higgledy-piggledy kind of just mess of POVs that you just don't need. And so making sure that those points of view that you're adding in are adding to the story and they're contributing to the whole, which again, we get with the antagonist, and then we got one of them that was sort of like okay, and she paid it off in the end, so she kind of got by with it, that kind of thing. So it's just my thing on POV. I don't know, are you the same, where you sort of are like, all right, let's
I'm the same. Yeah, I'm the same, but I would say if you're writing romance, you rarely see that. It's just not, and that's why you want to be intentional about what genre you're in. And I think because this does have those suspense thriller-ish, qualities to it. It doesn't feel out of place, but it also helped to solidify the sense of normalcy because it was introduced soon. Yeah. And so I would say those would be the caveats if you thought that that's something you wanted to do, because what it does is it establishes a precedent, and so that we're not shocked, and you shock us for the wrong reason.
Yeah. For sure, where it just takes us out of the story because we're like, wow, exactly. Who's this? Why are we here?
Exactly.
Wrong kind of shock.
Exactly.
So the last thing I just want to touch on, and this was just pulling from our conversation from characters last week, is the importance of, developing your antagonist with compelling motivations, right? Whether you're writing an epic fantasy or a romance or a crime story or some combination of all of the above, having an antagonist who is motivated, especially, if you're looking at your themes, I think pulling out thematic, applying your themes to your antagonist as well. So everyone's dealing with grief. What is the antagonist's grief? Or, if everybody feels, this is just a random example, if everybody feels that they have been subjected to some kind of injustice, well, what kind of injustice does your antagonist feel that they're trying to right in whatever it is that they're doing? And so developing your antagonist again with intention and giving them honestly maybe as much treatment as your protagonist in terms of what's driving them, how are they responding to the events of the story, and what you ask why them and why now. Same question for your antagonist, why now? Why is now the time that they're doing whatever it is that they're doing? Because that's part of what's going to add, even if your story isn't a mystery, a little bit of mystery to your story of who is this person and why are they the way they are. And it's something that the reader and the protagonist can kind of discover or experience along the way. And again, it's hugely important in crime because the motive for the killing matters, because that's a part of the discovery process as well in the crime story. It's part of your narrative drive. So making sure that even if they're not a POV character, that you do give them that treatment for motivation, and you take your themes and you're applying them to your antagonist and saying, well, how does the antagonist fit into these, and how have these impacted my antagonist, and how have they responded, out of their experience, and all of these things to create a more compelling and well-rounded I'm sorry, I think it's a protagonist. I meant antagonist. A more compelling and well-rounded antagonist, not just mustache twirling, I'm going to do evil because,
Evil. I agree, and I was
expecting the Austin Powers reference. Whoa!
Evil. Keep me on your toes. Okay, so I totally agree, and I think it's even more important when you don't have them on the page, right? I think it can be. I think it can almost feel a little bit easier if you do get to put them on the page because you get to explore all these things from their point of view. But most stories, you have that same energy there. It's just not on the page. Yeah. And so that's where, they should feel those ripples and the effects of it. And then we get to see a little bit more when they're the heroes at the mercy of the villain type of moment. But we should feel the effects of that antagonist the entire story, even when they don't know that is the source. Yeah. And so, yeah, definitely. I agree. Were there any other elements that you wanted to talk about as far as wrapping up this?
One thing, I'm just going to drop this in because this is something that I learned from a client of mine. I don't have any of his books handy. So Robert Ellis is a writer. This is going to be relevant, I promise. We're going to bring it around. Robert Ellis is a writer. He writes sort of crime, sort of like action crime thriller kind of in that pocket. He was originally indie. I think he got picked up by whatever Amazon's particular imprint, like where they kind of picked up their own imprint. They picked up indie authors. Anyway, one of my clients had said that he says that he literally, writes a timeline of the events. And on his timeline of events, for his crime story, he writes what the protagonist is doing and what the antagonist is doing off screen. And this is that same thing that we were talking about. So it was reminding me of just a precedent for this, authors doing this of he creates a timeline to say who is doing what at what time, so he can, so you can chart where is the antagonist trying to thwart the protagonist and where is the protagonist bumping into the antagonist and not knowing it, and just to sort of be able to establish so that your antagonist, if they're not a POV character, they're not just waiting in the wings for the protagonist to show up to their lair, but they're actually taking an active role in what's happening. And Things We Had Never Got Over is kind of a good example of this as well, where you've got, Tina doing all kinds of crap in the background and making trouble and making things worse for Naomi as the story goes along. So I wanted to just drop that one in there because it just popped in my mind. Yeah,
and I would say the way that I always do that is I do it in a spreadsheet. I do it in a spreadsheet so that I know where both of my MMC, my FMC, and my antagonist at every, especially at all of the major points of the story of what they're doing and the effects that they're feeling in that moment. And it's also something that can be helpful with timeline, but it can also be help you to determine what aspects of scenes and moments to highlight and to shine a light on, and which ones that are just not the best representation. So I totally agree.
Yeah. Did you have something else you were gonna? You said that remembered something.
Oh yes, that was, and I think this is my final thing for real. The last part that I don't know, I told Rachel I don't really have the words for it, but I do want to say that I did feel like there were aspects of the story that felt so steady that it kind of just felt like I was just going through the motions with reading. I personally do like a story that has a little more when it comes into the highs and the lows, so that I feel like I'm going on a journey with them. And for this to have such emotional stakes, I think it kind of almost felt very, I don't want to say neutral, but it just felt, I don't want to say, it's not flat, but it just felt like steady. That's what I put in my notes. It just felt steady. So I really would have liked to have a little bit more nuance. But I think looking at the story, had she done that, there would have been some certain moments that would have been a little too high stakes for this sort of romance if you're not going into dark. And I almost feel like she was intentionally almost like regulating the emotional sort of impact to sort of select her wording appropriately. But I do feel like it almost tempered some of the other areas that could have had a little bit more of an emotional impact.
Yeah. And that's where, I kind of hinted at this earlier, but I do think tying in the questions of the case to some of those moments so that, again, for example, our big crescendo moment at midpoint if it produced an insight about the case that tipped the case in a direction or made the case look like a dead end, or something to tie it into the central thread that was opened with the beginning of the story, like, would it maybe have fixed it fully? Maybe not, but it would have, I think, helped so that those big moments felt big moments, because it wasn't just like, whoa, this is a high stakes negotiation, but it's just, that's kind of all that it is, versus they're getting together, the case is about to fall apart, they're in this high stakes situation, right? And that would have kind of brought it that extra level up, I think, because because you have all of your threads rising and falling together, so that also means that they push each other up, or make the low lower. And I think that would have helped, because we do get, it starts with the case so central in the setup and the promise, and then it takes a back seat, and then it comes back, and then it takes a back seat, and then it comes back. And I think that that's part of that where we don't get quite as much crescendo, up and down as we move through the story.
Yeah, and I think I think that may be part of it. I don't know if that's as big of a part to me as a reader, but I believe it comes down to the types of stories that I like to read. Mm-hmm. The way that I would describe it is like the difference between a heart race and a heartache, right? Romance is a heartache. Yeah. And when it's written right, you feel that ache. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I felt the ache, and there was some very like childhood things that could have. Think about Lucian's story. Yeah. When we was reading and you're reading, you are like, oh my gosh, like you feel for him. You're almost like talking to the book. I didn't have any of those moments except for the true climax, like the real scene. And I was in that one, but the rest of the story was kind of like, oh, okay, you know what I mean?
Yeah, so, and I think, this was something we talked about like off camera as well. It's like, I wonder if some of that's coming from our crime story, where crime stories are, so like I think about The Whistleblower, mm-hmm. and it hits some very emotional things, right, with the death of his sister, and even when you're at that funeral, and it's kind of like, ooh, but it's not, but crime, the pacing of crime, and the emotional affect of crime in a way tends to be steadier, and there's a level of removal from the emotional elements, just mm-hmm. like one step removed, where we're not going too hard into the emotions. We're trying to lean more into the thrill or the curiosity, and not kind of digging out the emotional aspects quite as much. So I'm wondering if some of that too, like from the emotional perspective, is like a hallmark of it being like having that crime element in it as well.
Yeah, so that makes me, and then I know we want to get to like revealing our next book. It makes me wonder if that has a lot to do with the core audience, right? Because if you think about the core audience of your suspense and thrills, it's usually a male reader, mm-hmm. right? And romance is usually, female readers. It's not all, but that's normally, and I think emotionally, the way you metabolize different feelings or whatever, when you look at generally as genders, is sort of in the same way that we're talking about right now, right? A heartache versus a heartbeat, kind of racing. And that's what usually people are looking to for suspense and thrillers, that you have these life or stake moments, but it's more so of an excitement, adrenaline feel versus a heartbreaking, heart aching feeling. Yeah. And so I think at the end of the day, even as we're having this discussion, even if we are going back and forth of what her intentions were, you shouldn't be.
Yeah.
You should not be.
We're trying to guess at what's in someone else's mind.
Exactly.
You know your own mind.
That's right.
You're working between you and yourself. Know you.
And your readers. Exactly. Yeah. Know your readers. Because if your readers is having this discussion, something is wrong.
Yeah.
Because there's a missed opportunity. And I think here, because we can't ask the questions of the mm-hmm. author of like what the intentions were. And I believe that in order to regulate the other things that she was doing, it's almost like if you take a sleeping pill, everything's sleepy. You know, you can't pick, okay, I'm excited over here. No, everything's sleepy. So it's kind of like to hold that rhythm, you had to hold the rhythm, and it's probably a strategic choice that you would have to make. And I personally like the highs and lows, but I think it worked for this because I think if we would have got to the hostage situation, if we would have got to that climactic scene and it had too many highs and lows, that would have been an overload.
Yeah, it could have been too much.
Oh, it would have been an overload. So, you know what I mean? And I think this is just about knowing your story.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Is there anything else you want to hit before we tell the people what our next book is?
Absolutely not, because if we hit anything else, we're going to be hitting for another 4 episodes.
I know. Oh, man, it's true. We already, gave ourselves all the time that we wanted for the last 2 episodes. So, okay, so let's talk about our next pick, which is going to kick off. So next week, we're going to have one of our fun bonus episodes where we're going to talk about, we'll ask each other some questions, or maybe I don't know, we haven't decided yet, but we'll have a bonus episode, and then our book through, would that make it our July? Let's see, this is going to go through June. So yeah, our July book, which is perfect because it's such like a sassy, fun summer read, is going to be One for the Money by Janet Ivanovich. So this is my first time getting to read this book. So I ended up choosing it because it's been on my list forever, and it's a mystery, I think. I'm mostly sure it's a mystery. And and it's, this is such a famous and well-loved series. So I think it's a great pick for the summer, and I'm excited to get to experience it for the first time. I
think you're gonna like it, y'all. The fun fact on this book is, I was telling Rachel that I read this book when my youngest child, when I was pregnant with her, and she is 25. So. Oh my gosh. So that was a long time ago. I think it's a fun read. It's a series that has gone on forever. Yeah. I think it's one of those ones that I've always told you that it sort of reminded me of when we read the Sookie Stackhouse, the Sookie Stackhouse books.
Yeah.
And
it reads kind of similar too. I've started and you can feel some of the similarities.
Yeah, but I think it's a little bit more a little bit lighter, and I feel like it's a really true nod to cozy mysteries. Yes. And I had one of the students in our book club that said, "Oh, when she talks about all these places, those are real places." She's like, so she was like, that's one of the reasons why I love it, because I know the area. And I was like, oh, wow, I didn't know that. So, yeah, like, I think it is, you have your laugh out loud moments, you have your full cast, and I think it really does have a huge nod to, cozy mysteries, but with a little bit of an edge because she's a bounty hunter. Yeah. So, still amateur sleuth, but in a different type of way.
Yeah, and I caught that, and I always associate the Stephanie Plum novels with cozy, probably because there's such a heavy comedic element to it, and I think that she's a bounty hunter, but that comedy to it kind of offsets what could otherwise be, she's a badass bounty hunter and it's very serious. She kind of undermines it with the comedy to kind of like level it out. I checked the copyright date on the book. I believe it was published in 1997. And so it's, right. I've really enjoyed reading it because it's very nostalgic for me of like, oh my God, like early 90s, or well, I mean, this is late 90s, but like 90s.
Don't you say it.
What? Not just like 90s, like what life was like before, like so many of the things that we take for granted now.
Okay.
What am I trying not to say?
Listen, I was just so young and fresh getting out of high school. She's like, what is I gonna say? I was so fresh. I was in whatever. What grade was you in, Rachel?
In 1997, I wasn't even in school yet.
See, look at this. Y'all, listen.
I was 4 years old.
Listen. She hold no 4 fingers. This is why I say don't you say it. Old lady Rachel attacks, what is it, grandma of the internet? What they say?
Right. Internet grandma.
Again. Internet grandma attacks again. She's like, I wasn't even in school. Girl, listen, I had a whole career. Girl on child number 3.
Hero. I'm gonna grow up to be like you.
Oh my gosh. But no, but yes, but that makes me really want to go and read one of the later ones to see if she's brought that in, because you're talking about social media, cell phones, cell phones there were cell phones, but they weren't as prevalent then.
Yeah, right.
And so,
I wonder if the Janet Ivanovich books, if we watch, or if the Stephanie Plum books, if we watch, if we have these little artifacts of eras in the development of, things as we know them now, if we have artifacts of that through the fiction, because I think that, that's an incredible, if you think just from a historical perspective, to be able to track the way that the world shifts through fiction, through fun, lighthearted mystery comedy, watching the way the world is changing actively. That's quite interesting.
I'm over here giving her the evil eye. I can't see it because I'm just seeing where she's going with this. She's rolling her eyes
so hard at me.
She's like, just the history of America and dinosaurs.
How dare you, ma'am? I think that is very interesting, and it's a unique. Get out of here! Everything you own in a box to the left.
Before y'all had cell phones and social media. No, but I will say, I wonder if she did in the later ones just keep it in that time frame as if time hasn't passed. Because some of these stories, we were reading Louisiana Longshot. Mm-hmm. And that book was meant to be 1 week. And that series, she's on book 28.
And that's all still in 1 week?
No, I don't know. No, meaning book one was in 1 week.
I see.
So if you were to have 28 books, for example, it could be that it's only been a couple of years.
Yeah, tops.
If you wanted to do something like that, if that's the way you do it to
and then it becomes like a time capsule more, right? Where you keep it inside, and then it kind of has that nostalgic value, and it becomes sort of the brand of the story as well. Of this is late 90s, and this is when this series is placed, because the Sookie Stackhouse novels are kind of like that, right? They're kind of anchored in because it's moving at its own pace on its own time frame rather than alongside the actual publication,
right? But at the same time, the Sookie Stackhouses are not, that series is not that long.
It went for 9 books, I think.
And then I believe the Stephanie Plum is in the 30s.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. There's a lot of Stephanie Plum books.
Yeah, there is. So yeah, I think it's going to be interesting, and I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. I'm so excited for whatever sass you were going to give me about it. I'm very excited, and I also am really looking forward to the nostalgic aspect as well as all of the good writing tips and takeaways and brilliance that is Janet Ivanovich. So
I think it's going to be interesting for us to also have what would kind of feel like, I guess it wouldn't feel like a hybrid, like the Sookie Stackhouse. Well, actually, there's a love triangle. It's a slow burn love triangle. So yeah,
that's what I was thinking, is it's squarely, I think, in that kind of amateur sleuth, so where I am, but then also brings in I remember you telling me that there's a love triangle in it as well, so it's still gonna have some of those, some of your genre stuff.
Yeah, but it's slow burn too. So
yeah, well, if you're gonna write 55 books, you can't resolve it in book 1 or even book 10.
Girl, listen. It's a hotmess.com. But yeah, so that's going to be our next book. So go ahead and get your copies and get ready. I think it's going to be interesting. Technically we're back in another small town, but this will have a little more comedy. Yeah. Girl, because these people are going to be a mess. Her grandma and all of them. I can't wait. I haven't started it again, but I am. So I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. Well, you heard it here first, everyone. One for the Money by Janet Ivanovich is going to be our next pick. So we'll have bonus episode next week, and then the following week we'll launch into it with our first discussion of One for the Money. So grab your copy, start reading it now. You've got a little extra time. So go get it and give it a read. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining us for our discussion of Cold and Deadly by Toni Anderson. I took away so much rereading this book, and I hope that you also took away, some things that you can bring to your writing, some challenges, some answers to maybe some questions that you had. So until next week, when we come back with our bonus episode, don't forget to like this podcast or this video, subscribe, leave us a review, leave us a comment, let us know your thoughts on Cold and Deadly. If you know stuff about Janet Ivanovich and whether her stuff stays in the late 90s or if it moves with time, if you happen to know off the top of your head, and visit us at storydeepdive.com, and we will be back next week. We will see you then, and until then, happy writing.
Happy writing.